So, hello, comrades. I am with comrade Ramiro, Sebastian Funes, comrade from USA, but with origin from the Latin America, from Honduras. Yes,
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 correct.
and
Thank you so
and
much for having me.
yes, it is our guest who didn't come one week ago. So we, with comrade artistish, we made a presentation about history of the revolution in Nicaragua, and of course, I want to speak about this. But the question which we didn't know how to answer is what is the situation of Nicaragua today? And because you have been there, you have movies, could you present the situation now, and after we will come back to the to the beginning of this revolution.
Most definitely. So, I think one thing that's important to mention is that after the 1979 victory of the Sandinista revolution, a lot of people on the left internationally sort of forgot about what happened in Nicaragua. They saw the revolution, they saw the uprising, and then they stopped after that. But since 2007, since the re-election of President Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinista revolution, who is today the last living socialist president who came to power in a guerrilla movement, he is continuing to build socialism in Nicaragua. Since 2007, Nicaragua has been slowly but surely nationalizing key industries. Earlier this year, they nationalized the largest electrical company from a private corporation and brought it to under public control, bringing free public electricity and extremely low cost electricity to the masses. In Nicaragua, they have universal housing program with extremely low cost housing for all working class people, free healthcare and education for the youth, for everybody. They also have pension programs for the retired. And although Nicaragua is still one of the poorest countries in Latin America and the Caribbean because of capitalism, because of imperialism, everybody in Nicaragua is taken care of with the basics: food in their stomach, a roof over their head, access to healthcare and education. It's not the best, it's not perfect, but they're slowly but surely building socialism. And one of the most important developments that happened just about a week ago is that Nicaragua cut ties with the Republic of China, the fake China that they call it, Taiwan, and recognized the People's Republic of China, the legitimate Chinese government. And now what that means is that Nicaragua and China will have increased trade relations. They're already talking about increasing Chinese imports and Nicaraguan exports, joining the Belt and Road Initiative, and challenging the dominance of Panama, which is south of Nicaragua after Costa Rica. Panama Canal is U.S. controlled, dominated by the imperialists, and is one of the main transit ways of commerce internationally in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua and China have been working to build an interoceanic canal that goes through Nicaragua to have no cost trade between socialist countries around the world. So there's a lot of exciting things happening with Nicaragua. It's one of the countries that is building socialism that doesn't get the recognition and respect that it gets internationally because it's been slandered a lot more than so many other nations. People portray Daniel Ortega as a dictator. A lot of people don't even know he's a leftist, but he is a revolutionary socialist. As I mentioned before, the last living president who came to power in a guerrilla movement. So he is a living legend. He's somebody who traveled extensively throughout the Soviet Union, throughout China. The DPRK met with Kim Il sung and continues to be president. So, very positive developments in Nicaragua.
Okay, so because you mentioned the situation in last days, I want to ask you a quick question about the new president of Chile. His name is Boris, I think. If I good understand, he's a social democratic pro-imperialist leftist. And one thing which because I have no idea who is this person. It's yesterday that I started to I listened the conversation about him in the gray zone, and
Mm.
they present him like a guy who the last I don't know last 10 years in his political activity in Chile all the time repeated that he hates Venezuela, he hates Nicaragua, he hates China, etc. But could you explain me why he hates Nicaragua and Venezuela, his new guy in Chile?
That's a great question. That's something that even within the left, the Latin American left, has been a frequent topic of debate with Boris in Chile. He's somebody, here's the thing, right? I'm the kind of person, as a Marxist Leninist, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt because a lot of people said the same about Hugo Chavez when he was elected president of Venezuela. When Chavez was elected in 1999, he said, I'm not a socialist or a capitalist. I'm for the third way. I don't believe in the Soviet Union. And a lot of this was, in a sense, a tactic to get elected because, again, right, we're talking about 1999, the aftermath of the Soviet Union, which obviously I support and admire. But a lot of people, the narrative was that socialism does not work. The Soviet Union failed. That was the common narrative. Chavez understood this and was tailoring his message, so to speak, to make it seem like he wasn't a socialist. And through his process of building socialism, was able to be like, actually, yeah, this is socialism that we're building. Same with Fidel Castro. One of his famous quotes: "I am not a Marxist-Leninist, but Fidel Castro, we know, is somebody who, throughout the Cuban Revolution, a few years after the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1962, he declared the class character of the Cuban Revolution to be socialist." So, why do I say this? I say this because a lot of times we have to not judge people by what they say, but by what they do. We can't write people off right away just based on what they're saying. And however, that being said, obviously I disagree with what Boris was saying about Nicaragua. I disagree with what he said about Venezuela and Cuba because those are the nations in the region that have stood up to the OAS, to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the US imperialist class. And you have to give respect where it's due, especially if you consider yourself a leftist. And yes, I would agree he is a social democrat and he was regurgitating a lot of imperialist talking points. But I would wait and see a few more weeks, few more months. Let's see what his policies are until we can definitively say, yeah, he's a pro-imperialist social democrat puppet. I think we should wait a little bit to get to that conclusion. I'm leaning toward it. I think I agree with the gray zone. That's probably what he's going to end up being. But I think it's one of those things that we have to kind of wait and see what happens.
Yes, but they said, for example, that in 2018 he make a statement that he support the colored revolution against Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's true. That is true. That is very true. He said a lot of things I don't agree with, and I think that Boric in Chile, he is trying to appease many classes at once. He's trying to appease the grassroots left base because in Chile there is a radical movement. Chile has a long history of revolutionary socialism, of resistance, but Chile also is home to Pinochet, has a lot of actual Nazis who left Germany, who left Eastern Europe and fled to Chile and resettled there, who are part of that right wing government of Sebastián Piñera, who supported Gast, who was the other right wing candidate. So I feel like he's trying to appease many sectors. I do not agree with Boric on what he said about Nicaragua, Cuba. He supports the color revolutions. I hope that he eventually is able to trade and be friendly with the left anti-imperialist countries in the region, but I highly doubt that'll happen. But I think eventually, if he continues along that path, he's going to experience something similar that happened to Michel Bachelet, who was another president of Chile, who also said she was socialist or social democrat, who said she was left leaning, who said she was progressive, but just ended up supporting the same neoliberal policies in Chile that were in place for many years, with just a kinder, gentler, and more inclusionary face. So I think, it'll be interesting to see how he manages these contradictions.
There is one important, interesting thing about the Michelle Bachelet, that she, I don't know who was she 3 years ago, but I think that she was something important in United Nations. And in the time when there was a beginning of the Yellow West movement in France, and there was a lot of police violence in the street of Paris. That every Sunday, every Saturday, the police are arrested a lot of people, tearing gas, and it was something that everybody thinking, no, things like this, it is good for the third world, but not for the European Union. And she make a statement. She accused Macron that he is a dictator or something like this. She was solidaire, make her solidarity with this Yellow West movement. I participated in this movement, and but it is a little other subject. So you said one thing very important, that Daniel Ortega, he is a guy who was the leader of the socialist country, and he fight for this. He participated in the revolution, and it is important from Polish perspective, from the East European perspective, because in East European we had socialist countries, but it was most of the job, it is the Red Army and Soviet Union who helped us to liberate. It was not the revolution only the Polish revolutionaries. So from this perspective, and in Poland all the time it was this idea that the socialism, it is something that it is not Polish, that it was came from Russia, from Soviet Union. So it was not authentic. Of course, in the 50s, the socialism was a lot of popularity, but after it was starting to decline. And so could you start from the beginning? Who was Daniel Ortega? How this guerrilla movement started? And now I will not to stop you talk because you are the best specialist.
Thank you so much, and it's fascinating. Before I get into that, to know that you're a revolutionary Polish communist. It's always amazing and beautiful to meet and hear from something like that, because here in the United States, I grew up my whole life with a lot of Polish people, and many of them are anti-communist, very right-wing, very conservative. And there is Polish communism. There is socialist history in Poland, contrary to what some people say that it's imposed. There are so many legendary Polish revolutionaries. So I think it's an honor to be able to share that internationalism and to learn from people like in Poland and Eastern Europe. In terms of the Sandinista movement and Daniel Ortega, the important thing to recognize is that there are many stages of the Sandinista revolution. The primary, just to quickly give a crash course of the history leading up to it, because it's important to understand the context of national liberation. This year, 2021, is the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of Central American independence. So the Central American countries of Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, the 5 countries. The flag of Honduras, my country, has 5 stars, which represents the 5 countries of Central America. Nicaragua is in the central of Central America. And in 1821, 200 years ago, the Central American countries achieved independence from Spanish colonialism and eventually became the Central American Federation. So those 5 countries, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, were one nation, one federation of countries that were united and had one flag. Eventually, that federation was led by a man by the name of Francisco Morazan, who was an independence hero, a national hero to the Central American people. Many parts of Central America are named after him. And Morazan was a contemporary of many other figures of that time in Latin America as well. Simon Bolivar, who came from Venezuela. You have the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela named after Simon Bolivar, who also created a united Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, Ecuador, liberated Bolivia. And during this time in the 1800s, you had many figures who wanted to create these giant federations of countries united against empire. They saw that the United States in the 1800s, imperialism was rising, right? Lenin talks about this in his pamphlet, Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism. The 1800s was the ascendancy of finance capital, U.S. imperialism. The U.S. expanded into what was Mexico at the time, taking over lands, taking over Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And so Morazan was a unifying figure who wanted to maintain that Central American Federation. Unfortunately, he was killed in battle by conservative US backed forces, and the nations were split. So you had Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, they split. They became balkanized, easier to conquer. Fast forward to the early 1900s, you had a figure by the name of Sandino, who you had earlier. He's the guy with the nice cowboy hat, with the guns that wrapped it. Sandino, there you go. Viva la Revolución. Augusto Cesar Sandino. He was born in the late 1800s, was a revolutionary during the early 1900s. He is the father of the Nicaraguan people of the Sandinista revolution. That is what the party and the movement is named after. And Augusto Cesar Sandino is somebody who was deeply inspired by the Mexican Revolution. He was deeply inspired by the Russian Revolution of the slogan peace, land, and bread, and applied that to Latin America and the Caribbean. Augusto Cesar Sandino was a contemporary of Farabundo Martí, who was the founder of the Central American Communist Party, which was one of the earliest communist parties in Latin America, established in the early 1920s during the Third International, during Stalin, during the revolutionary era of the internationals. And Farabundo Martí and Augusto Cesar Sandino wanted to revive the dream of Morazan of building a united Central America, but under a new socialist system, a new socialist government. We're seeing that around this time in the early 1920s, you have the Russian Socialist Republic joining with other socialist republics, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and forming the Soviet Union. And that is what Farabundo Martí, what Augusto Cesar Sandino took inspiration from and also wanted to apply in Central America, a sort of Soviet Union in Central America, a socialist federation. That was the constant dream. And in many ways, Farabundo Martí, who was Sandino's closest confidants and comrades, he traveled to New York to attend the Anti-Imperialist League of the Americas, to meet the Communist Party USA. He traveled to the Soviet Union to meet with communists there. Sandino stayed locally. He traveled to Mexico mainly to meet with leaders of the Mexican Revolution, which had just overcome its hardest era in the 1910s. Sandino was somebody who organized the mass peasantry, the indigenous population against the small ruling class, white descended Nicaraguans. Sandino is indigenous. He is a socialist. He's anti-imperialist. He came into direct hand-to-hand combat with U.S. Marines, not just the proxies of the Marines, but the U.S. Marines themselves, because the U.S. invaded Nicaragua over 12 times in the early 1900s. And it's actually where the Marines got their earliest start in terms of fighting. Sandino was leading the guerrilla movement of indigenous peoples, of peasants against the Marines, and saying that patria libre o morir, we want a free country or death, and fighting the US imperialists directly. And Sandino was very cunning. He was known as somebody who knew the landscape very well. He understood the jungles and the mountains very well. And oftentimes he would play tricks on the US Marines. He would sneak into the bases of the US Marines and leave little notes that said, better luck next time, or patria libre o morir, free fatherland or death, get off our land. And that's something that he was known for. He was very clever. He was very cunning. And he was somebody who was revered as one of the ancestors of Nicaragua, somebody who was a contemporary as well of Emiliano Zapata, who we see on there, Farabundo Martí, who's on the bottom left, who we see as well. And Sandino, unfortunately, in the early 1930s, was captured and murdered only after being betrayed by one of the Nicaraguan figures who eventually took over the Somoza dynasty. Sandino was executed, and he was somebody who the Marines had a tough time fighting against. So between the 1930s, 1932, 1933, under FDR, by the way, who in the U.S. so many quote unquote leftists say is progressive, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He supported the assassination of Sandino, and he imposed the right wing U.S. backed dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza, which ruled the country from 1932, 1933, all the way until 1979. Decades of a brutal right wing US backed dictatorship that supported the anti communist movement, that was part of the Anti Communist League, that was fascist in many ways. So in the 1960s, you had the rise, many key events, right? In the late 1950s, many key events that revived the Sandinista movement. You had the Algerian independence, national liberation movement that was led by the National Liberation Front of Algeria, of Algiers, right? And then you also had the Cuban Revolution of 1959 that was successful in overthrowing Batista, a US backed dictator, the first successful socialist revolution in the Americas. And this was very appealing to the Nicaraguan people who were being oppressed by the Somoza dictatorship. And in the 1960s, you had several figures, one of them being Carlos Fonseca, who was one of the main founders of the Sandinista Front. He was a Marxist Leninist. He was deeply inspired by Lenin and Stalin. He was deeply inspired by the Soviet Union and China. And he studied the works of Marx. He wanted to apply socialism to the conditions of Nicaragua, understanding that you have to mold socialism to the country that you're trying to build it in. So he's somebody who not only called it the National Liberation Front, but the Sandinista National Liberation Front in adaptation to Nicaragua's socialist history. And Tomás Borge, another revolutionary leader of the Sandinista Front, they established the FSLN, which today remains the party of the Sandinistas. And the FSLN combined the ideas of Marxism, Leninism, of liberation theology, which is a progressive interpretation of Catholicism that recognizes Jesus Christ as a communist, as a socialist, because Jesus was somebody who was battling against the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees who valued the temple, right? The Pharisees were people who, the money changers, they were changing money in Solomon's temple. And Jesus said, no, the temple is within. It's not about these fancy buildings. It's not about changing money and dominating currency. It's about reaching out to everybody. The Pharisees believed that only the chosen people could continue the word of God. Jesus said anybody can continue the word of God. And that was one of the ideological inspirations of liberation theology, that everybody is good. Everybody can be saved. Everybody can have a role in revolution. And the Sandinistas were deeply inspired by it. I think this mural kind of perfectly sums up the inspirations of Jesus, of progressive liberation theology, Christian socialism, with Sandinismo, Sandino on the left, and Che Guevara on the right, bottom right, who represented armed struggle, focal theory, guerrilla movements inspired by Mao Zedong. Combining all of these, synthesizing these into Sandinismo, that is really what it's about. And in the 60s and 70s, the Sandinistas waged armed struggle on the border with Honduras against the Somoza dictatorship. It was a over decades-long struggle until the 1979 victory of the Sandinista revolution. The Somoza dictatorship was overthrown, and the Sandinistas liberated Managua and Nicaragua from the U.S.-backed dictatorship. That is Sandino in the early days, in the 20s, taking a picture. And the Sandinistas in 1979, this was the second successful socialist revolution. Now, so you had Cuba, 1959, which was the only socialist country in the region until 1979. And that was an amazing accomplishment, because now you had another socialist country, and the US was very scared at that point, 1979. And that's actually one of the reasons that led to the rise of Reaganism in the US, because Jimmy Carter was president, and the neocon conservatives said that the US was being too soft on communism. The US was scared. There was actually a Time magazine cover of Daniel Ortega that says Reagan sees red, that basically had Daniel Ortega on the front. And there was a real fear. There was all these movies, Red Dawn, and all this propaganda that said that Daniel Ortega was going to lead an invasion of the, we're talking about Nicaragua, a country with a population of 6 million people, the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And Reagan was like, oh, they're going to invade our country. We need to go in. So what happened is that 1980, 1981, 1982, along with the color revolution, here's where it gets interesting, because now this ties in with what happened in Poland and Eastern Europe, right? In the 1980s, you had the rise of, open societies, George Soros, the color revolutions, Zbigniew Brzezinski, that strategy of attacking the left from the left, branding the anti-communist opposition not as right-wing fascists, but as progressive liberal hippies. We just want democracy. And that's exactly what they did in Nicaragua as well, just like they did in Eastern Europe. They created a group called the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries. They branded them as pro-democracy freedom fighters. They armed and trained them from the U.S., Israel as well, by the way. Menachem Begin, who's the prime minister of Israel, he financed and trained the Contras. Taiwan, South Korea, Chile under Pinochet, they supported the Contras, and Ronald Reagan as well. A lot of evangelical Christians supported that. And during this time period, the Contras were waging war against Nicaragua, invading Nicaragua from the north, from Honduras. And my father's hometown was the base where the Contras were trained. And my father would tell me stories growing up of how these Contras would go around the area killing people if you were a student who supported Marx or Lenin. If you had a book even about socialism, they would kill you. They would transport drugs from South America. At this time, the Contras were collaborating with the Colombian drug cartels that were trafficking cocaine, and they served as middlemen, because if you look at a map, Nicaragua is right in the center of Latin America. It's a transit point between South and North America. So the Contras were bringing cocaine and drugs from South America to North, and that's where you have the rise of the Mexican drug cartels, the street gangs, the Bloods and the Crips in the U.S., and they were also killing and murdering left-wing Sandinistas. The Contras are very horrible people. And by the way, on my channel, I interviewed a former Contra commander who is now a Sandinista supporter, and she gives a whole detail and biography about her time with the Contras, why she regrets it, and why now she supports the Sandinista movement. So into the 80s, from 1979 to 1989, that was the first stage of the Sandinista revolution. After the armed struggle, Daniel Ortega was president, and they accomplished many great things during this time period. The Sandinistas established land reform. They nationalized millions of acres of land and redistributed it to the peasants of of Nicaragua, the working class. They created a national literacy campaign to teach people how to read and write. They began building food sovereignty programs to become reliant only on themselves to feed themselves. They also helped liberate women and oppressed communities and nationalities. In Nicaragua, the Afro-Indigenous peoples have autonomous lands on the Caribbean coast. The Miskitu Mayagna people, Garifuna people, they have access to their own land. So over 50% of Nicaragua's territory is actually autonomous regions for Afro-Indigenous peoples. Many great things were accomplished in this era. However, 1989, you all know what happened. Big shift in the global socialist movement. The overthrow. I don't like to say the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it makes it seem like socialism failed inherently. It was the coup against the socialist Soviet government and the color revolutions of Eastern Europe. And so that had a tremendous impact, because now Nicaragua lost one of its biggest trading partners, the Soviet Union. The Sandinistas lost the election in 1990. So from 1990 to 2006, 16 years of neoliberalism under the governments of Violeta Barrios Chamorro and several others, who basically rolled back all of the gains made under the Sandinista revolution, privatized schooling, privatized land, gave everything back to the rich. And so 2006, 2007, as we see in this picture, we have the pink tide. You have the rise of Bolivarianism, Chavismo in Venezuela. You have Fidel Castro still at the helm in Cuba. You have Evo Morales in Bolivia. You have Rafael Correa in Ecuador. You have Lula da Silva in Brazil. so many other movements, progressive Lugo, Fernando Lugo in Paraguay, so many left-wing movements coming to power. Exactly this era, this is when the Sandinistas come back into power, and Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo once again become president and vice president. And so from 2007, when they come back to the present, now to 2021, another era. This is the second era of the Sandinista revolution, which we're still currently in now, continuing to pick up where they left off in the 80s, redistributing land again, starting off from scratch, but still doing it, building food sovereignty, building Afro-Indigenous rights, building women's rights. Nicaragua today is one of the best countries for women to live in terms of gender parity, which is very difficult for a lot of other Latin American and Caribbean countries because of the history of patriarchy and oppression. Nicaragua is one of the safest countries, not only in Central America, but in Latin America and the Caribbean. Keep in mind that just a few years ago, Honduras, the neighboring country, had the highest murder rate in the world, as well as one of the most violent countries. So, a region that is plagued by drugs, crime, gangs, narco gangs, corruption, coups. Nicaragua has been a stable society, a socialist democracy in the region. A lot of great things have been accomplished. I was able to travel to Nicaragua twice this year, in March and in July. And I produced a documentary, Nicaragua Against Empire, where I directly speak with people of all backgrounds in Nicaragua, where they discuss the successes of the Sandinista revolution, what it has accomplished. And I have to say, it's really inspiring, a really beautiful nation that continues to advance towards socialism, continues to build socialism, that I think more people on the left should learn about.
Thank you, comrade. Sorry for my question, which maybe you will consider a little stupid, but
No, no worries.
from the European perspective, nobody speak about Nicaragua. Nobody speak about Daniel Ortega. It is something like you can make a lecture about a planet of Mars, and it will be the same, that you speak so many things which are totally new for me. So maybe the first question which I want to ask you is, what was the international politic of the Nicaragua in 1980s? I am thinking about this complicated question. China, Soviet Union split. They they collaborated with China. I know. I heard that the guy from Poland, Jaruzelski, he sent the weapon to the Nicaragua. So it seems that there was some collaboration with Poland, but I know nothing. So could you say something?
Most definitely. I think one of the best ways to do that. I don't know if you can see this on my end, but this is a picture. I just put it in the bottom part.
Yes, I can.
Um, this is a picture of
Oh,
Daniel
Brezhnev.
Ortega. No. This is. It looks like Brezhnev actually. This is a picture of Kim Il Sung and Daniel
Ah,
Ortega. So Daniel Ortega was deeply inspired by the Korean Revolution, and is somebody who he cites in his diaries as being a very important inspiration. As we know, the DPRK in the Sino-Soviet split 1961-1962 took a neutral position. The DPRK said, "We want unity among all socialist nations. We'll trade and support both the Soviet Union and China." And I think this is, in my opinion, it was the correct principled line. Cuba as well took this position. And the Sandinista revolution very much took this role, took this political line where we want unity with China and with the Soviet Union. And it's interesting because within the Sandinista revolution in the 80s, there was three main trends. There was the prolonged People's War faction of the Sandinista front, which was pro China, which was pro Albania, pro China. They considered the Soviet Union to be social imperialist. They said that China is the only real revolutionary socialist country. There was also a another faction in the Sandinista movement, which is more reformist, more social democratic, more religious. more conservative. That wasn't even necessarily 100% communist. They were more kind of like liberal Christian Catholics. And then Daniel Ortega was part of the third faction. They were called terceristas, or the third wayists within that. And they were Marxist Leninists who advocated unity among all oppressed sectors, between Maoists, between the liberal Christian Catholics, and advocated for a united front against imperialism, which is very much the political line of Daniel Ortega, who's on the left, and very much also Kim Il Sung. Kim Il Sung is somebody who also an underrated figure on the left as well, who promoted internationalism and unity as much as possible within the left, did not promote ideological purity, but also maintained that revolutionary edge to socialism, which at that time period, unfortunately, was being lost in certain places. So I think within that global socialist camp, he's somebody who was, and I think the reason for that is because we're talking about very small countries, right? Cuba is very small. Nicaragua is very small. Korea, compared to other countries, very small. So for smaller countries building socialism, we need all the help we can get, and we can't afford to be ideological purists when it comes to who we're trading with and why. So I think very much Daniel Ortega follows this on, even to this day. Daniel Ortega collaborates with Iran. That's not necessarily socialist, but is anti-imperialist, right? With Zimbabwe, with many countries around the world. So I think he's somebody who, because of his revolutionary experience, I mean, he's the last sitting socialist president who was, he's seen all of that. He has so much experience, so he understands the importance of unity.
Okay, so now I will ask you second question about this guy here. As you see, the Karol Wojtyła from Poland, the Pope John Paul II, and the second, and the history of the Polish Catholic Church is the last 40 years. It is the really reactionary force in Poland. That the history of Catholic Church in Poland is in the time of the Second World War and in the first years after the Second World War, when there was the creation of socialism, many of Polish priests, they supported maybe not the revolution, but they understood that there are things which need to be changed. And also there was a question that the Polish the leaders of the socialist Poland, they wanted to split the Catholic Church and create the Polish Catholic Church. It's something like continue the Reformation from the 16th century. It was because the Vatican, he didn't recognize the new Polish territories, which was German before the Second World War, and he didn't want to accept the Polish bishops in Wrocław, Szczecin. So he said that because all these bishops, German bishops, they are still alive, I can't make second bishops. Of Polish bishops. So the communists in Poland, they used this and spread the anti-Vatican propaganda. And many people, they said, yes, we are Catholic and we prefer the Polish National Catholic Church. And we can say that in 1950s, there are a lot of priests in Catholic Church which are progressive. But unfortunately, in 1970s, when we have this strategy of Zbigniew Brzezinski to destroy the socialist camp, he started to using all the reactionary forces in the world to destroy the socialism, and he used the fanatic in Afghanistan, he used the fanatics in China, so he can use the Islamists, Buddhists, Catholic. It's not necessary what kind of religion, but always he promoted the fanatic. And so in Poland, the tragedy of the Polish counter-revolution, it is of course the tragedy of the economic system, that it was collapsing, and unemployment, poverty, and but it is also the tragedy in the level of the superstructure that we have now. They tried to build the theocratic state in Poland. They banned abortion. They persecuted. They introduced the religious propaganda in the school. They built the monument of the Pope in every city, in every street, and it's very, very now Poland is it's ugly country. And I try
Mm.
to understand uh, how it is possible that in the same time the same Catholic Church in Poland was the reactionary anti-communist force, and in Nicaragua there was a lot of Catholic priests who supported revolution.
That's a great analysis, because that's such a great point, because in Eastern Europe and Poland in particular, Catholicism has manifested itself in a very reactionary way compared to Latin America, where certain movements have adopted it in a revolutionary way. Hugo Chavez, for example, was a Catholic who talked about Jesus Christ and Marx and Bolivar. Sandinista revolution as well, composed of many priests. One of the biggest ambassadors of the Sandinista revolution, Miguel de Escoto, was a priest. So many priests who were part of the guerrilla movements all over the region. And it's a very interesting point of conversation. I think a big part of it has to do with the emphasis of the anti communist movement at the time. I think that one of the things that's important to mention is that in Latin America, Catholicism had a different interpretation. Gustavo Gutierrez, who's one of the founders of liberation theology, he came from Peru. He understood and interpreted the Bible in an anti-capitalist way. And we have to remember that anti-capitalism predates socialism. What do I mean by that? That the Christian church, the Catholic Church, officially is against capitalism on paper. And historically, feudalism opposed capitalism, not necessarily because it was good or anything like that, but just because of the values and the standards that it had, that it worshiped the money and capital instead of God and the family. So I think that what's interesting is that in Eastern Europe, the imperialist class was able to combine Catholicism and Christianity with reactionary elements like capitalism and the free market in a way that was more effective than in Latin America. And I think a lot of that has to do, I think a lot of that has to do with levels of poverty, because again, we have to remember, right, that we're talking about Eastern Europe. The reason why before the socialist revolutions of Eastern Europe was extremely impoverished. Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, very, very, very poor compared to Western Europe. The only reason why there has been a modicum of economic development in Eastern Europe was because of socialism, because of the revolutionary governments that were established, especially after World War II, but after the Soviet Union as well. You have economic development, right? In the so what happens is that you have a generation into the 50s, 60s, 70s in Eastern Europe that didn't know what it was like to live in Eastern Europe before socialism, and experienced a level of alienation where they said, okay, I'm going to believe this right wing propaganda. I'm going to turn to Catholicism, to Christianity. But in Latin America and the Caribbean, as I mentioned earlier, Cuba was the only country that had established socialism in 1959. And it wasn't until 1979 that there was another socialist nation, Nicaragua. So the standard of living in Latin America remained poor because it remained under capitalism and imperialism. Whereas in Eastern Europe, you had more generations of wealth created because of socialism. You had more stability, more economic development. So in a way, like in Latin America and the Caribbean, when you had these people talking about communism is so bad, socialism is so bad, nobody really believed it because they were still living in capitalist poverty. And what happened is that they that created space for the church because one of the things too that's important to recognize is that the a lot of the foundations of the Sandinista revolution, the first organizing meetings were in churches. The churches were the organizing basis of where these different cells that they would call themselves were founded. And one of the tricks that they used to do, because it was the only institution that was permitted. So during the Somoza dictatorship, it was illegal to assemble more than like more than five or more people in something that was not the church. So if you were even just a regular political party, you were not allowed to congregate in mass. That was banned unless you were with a church. So the communists understood, okay, we're going to use the church as an organizing space because that's the only way that we can meet with the people in mass and not be killed by the Somoza regime. So what they did is that a lot of times they would have churches with a chalkboard. You know those chalkboards in school that will flip. So they will have on one side a chalkboard that had Bible verses and like and hymns and prayers, and then on the other side it would have like guerrilla warfare strategies and Marxist quotes and stuff like that. So they would flip it whenever the Somoza guards would come in. They would flip the chalkboard and say, "Oh, we're all just in church praying and worshiping." Once the guards left, they would go back to their organizing meetings and organize with the people. Those are one of the anecdotes of the Sandinista revolution. So a lot of the reasons why the revolution manifested itself through the church was because it was the only space legally allowed within these capitalist right-wing dictatorships that were allowed to meet and congregate in person. That was the only space available. So they manifested itself through those churches. And I think in Eastern Europe, because you had a new generation of what today we would call the boomers, or they didn't grow up with seeing old feudal Poland, under the reactionary middle age governments. So they didn't have that context, right? So they a lot in many ways sort of began believing the Western propaganda. And this is also an important era to the 60s. There's a lot of psychological operations that coincide with this era. The hippie movement, the US branding, Coca-Cola and blue jeans and hippies, that played a major role in the cultural war because imperialism is not just economic and political, it's also cultural, spiritual, ideological. It's a hybrid war. So by bringing this idea, and even like you see the Berlin Wall people, like they were kind of dressed as hippies. They gave flowers to the GDR people. They totally rebranded imperialism to either take to make it seem like, oh, we're this hip young new generation of people. So I think those are sort of the reasons why Catholicism and Christianity play different roles in these two regions, even though they both had very similar levels of poverty. I think because Eastern Europe underwent socialist development earlier, they were able to go through that now. But it's funny because now today, in 2018, for example, during the 2018 coup attempt in Nicaragua against Daniel Ortega, there was a section of the Catholic Church that allied against itself against the Sandinista revolution, and they started using some of the tactics that were used in Poland, Hungary, and other places. The color revolutions, the right wing Catholic priests, all these things were used. So I feel like Marx even talks about this, right? The unequal development, that like even though internationally we're all under capitalism, we're in different stages of capitalist development. And so I think Eastern Europe is a little bit more ahead of Latin America in that sense.
Now I think that in Poland, the experience of the Sandinista movement was studied by the Solidarność, because this strategy that you can organize the anti-government activity in the church, it is exactly the strategy of the Solidarność in 1980s.
Yep. Yeah. No, definitely.
Okay, so could you say something about the government of the Sandinista today? What do they think about religion? They are Catholic, and especially I am interested about the question of women, because 1 year ago the biggest protest movement in capitalist Poland was a very big movement in Poland 1 year ago. It was in October and November, when in every Polish cities there was a woman demonstration, because the abortion now in Poland is totally banned.
Yeah.
And it was already banned in after counter-revolution, but there was some exception, and this exception was liquidated 1 year ago. So it provoked one more time the big movement of women, and it was the demonstration of the woman, but very quickly it became the demonstration of all the Polish people, because of the economic crisis and because of COVID, because many other question that the government of Poland is not managed well. The catastrophe of the healthcare system, 2,000 Poles, 200,000 Poles died on more than because of COVID, and many. The population of Poland are smaller now, and if I good understand the situation in Nicaragua of abortion, it's banned, yes?
Yes, correct.
Yes, and now the question for me, for the strategy of Poland, that if we will try to build the communist movement, and we will try to present Daniel Ortega like our guy, and say that we are the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Daniel Ortega, Fidel Castro, and this woman will cry for us. No, Daniel
Right.
Ortega, he is like the PIS government. He banned abortion. He is against women. How you? What do you? What is your conseil to us? How we have to present the revolution in Nicaragua to Polish women?
That's a great point, and I think it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, actually, because one thing that's important to recognize is that there are different types of feminism. There is bourgeois feminism, bourgeois liberal feminism, exemplified by people like Femen and Pussy Riot, who are pro EU, pro fascist, pro capitalism and neoliberalism, who they use the same tactics and strategy against Vladimir Putin, against Lukashenko. They brand anti-imperialist governments. Well, they're not perfect, right? We don't necessarily agree with them 100%, but they brand them as reactionary, backward people who we need to go in and civilize and bomb the crap out of, because and they use women's rights or abortion rights as a vehicle to do that. And in many ways, that has been the strategy of organizations like Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, where we look at the roots of the quote unquote abortion rights movement, and it's very much rooted in eugenics. Look up Margaret Sanger whenever you can, whenever you have time. Look up Margaret Sanger, the eugenicist, the liberal eugenics movement, and a lot of these people who are in that are liberal imperialists who view colonized peoples as inferior, who supported population control. And I think there's also a different kind of feminism. If you go to, I have a video on my channel. If you get a chance to check it out at one point, it's called Proletarian Feminism Inside a Woman's Coffee Co-op in Nicaragua. And I spoke to Afro-Indigenous Nicaraguan coffee farmers who are feminists, who are socialists, but they sure don't support liberal bourgeois feminism. They support working class feminism of women in the rural country areas. And sure, they're Catholic, sure, they're more conservative socially, but they're still feminists. And their understanding and interpretation of feminism is different from the feminism we're going to get from women in cosmopolitan coffee shops and academia. It's very different. So I think that's the important thing to mention, is that just as like nobody has a monopoly over what it means to be Catholic or Christian, nobody has a monopoly over what it means to be feminist. You can be a woman who's in favor of women's liberation and feminism and still be Christian and Catholic and be against abortion. And that sounds controversial to a lot of the fake left or to a lot of the liberal left, but that's the reality. People have different understand. In Iran, same thing in Iran. Like, you have women, strong women who are in government in Iran, who are pro women, pro women's liberation, but their understanding of women's liberation is not tied in with having a PhD and working at a coffee, being able to live, have this or that Western lifestyle. So I think a big part of it is just understanding that, having the respect to say, yeah, women in different countries have different understandings of feminism. There's Islamic feminism, there's, Latin American Christian feminism, there's bourgeois liberal feminism. And in many ways, a lot of those movements, the liberal feminism, are backed by NGOs, the open societies, by these groups that weaponize it against anti-imperialist governments.
But from Polish perspective, it's totally different. That my position, uh, I have one strategy. If I don't know something or I don't understand something, I always try to search in history what Soviet Union made, what Polish Socialist Republic made. And if I see in the question of abortion that in socialist Poland abortion was free, in capitalist Poland is banned. So because everything in socialist is better than in capitalist, so it is without any idea, reflection, I support this solution which existed in socialist Poland. And it is not only the question of abortion. Abortion is one of the symbol, but the clericalization of Poland and all this ideology that the family is the base of the society. They liquidate the crash. They liquidate all this system of the state helping to raise a young child. I am the father of my son who have 22 months, and it's very complicated now here in France to find a crash. In my small city, I am living in the suburbs of Paris. There are the 400 children in the age of crash, and only 60 place in the public crash, and other have to pay for the private, and I am paying for the private a lot of money, and it's very not good if somebody have to pay, and many people don't have this money to pay, so they are staying all the day with young baby who cry. It's a lot of problem. I don't know you have baby or not, but it's very complicated to make political activity. So I don't know if you see I am in bathroom because all my house, it's
Your
all my
baby runs your
house.
house.
Yes, and here I can close myself and have a little silence. Um, so okay, so maybe we will talk a little bit about Honduras, because I want to use this situation that also. Uh, could you say something about this woman, Xiomara Castro? The question is, who is she? Is she communist, social democrat? Because I make my small research that she is a wife of the guy who was a president of Honduras, but this guy was not leftist.
Yeah, Xiomara Castro de Celaya is the wife of former president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya de Rosales. Manuel Zelaya was the president of Honduras in 2008, 2009. He was taken out in a US-backed military coup in 2009, June 28th, carried out by the US military, the Honduran military, and he was kidnapped in the middle of the night. He was taken in his pajamas and flown to Costa Rica to the jungle and left there. And horrible stuff has happened in Honduras since. It's been a right wing neoliberal hellhole in Honduras since the 2009 coup. We're talking about free trade zones that have no regulations on labor, zero taxes, the free market sweatshops. If you look at your clothes or any materials around you, you'll probably find shirts that say made in Honduras, because so many of the sweatshops that were established, they have exploited labor there. So, and Honduras was actually the country where the term banana republic was coined from, because of the United Fruit Company during the 50s and 60s that set up banana plantations all along the northern coast of the Caribbean and basically exploited labor. So Honduras, compared to Nicaragua, compared to other countries in Central America, has had a very radically different history. Historically run, never had a socialist government or president, never had a revolution that was successful in the way that Nicaragua was. So when Manuel Zelaya de Rosales came into power in 2006, 2007, in the pink tide, this was very, very monumental, because Honduras has historically been that's where the Contras are trained. That's where the School of the Americas had a very strong base and has always been a bastion of reaction in that region. So when he came into power, granted, he wasn't necessarily even a quote unquote socialist, but he was a progressive liberal. He wanted to trade with Venezuela, he wanted to trade with Cuba, join ALBA, the Bolivarian alliance, trade more with China. Even those minor little reforms were enough to get him ousted in the coup. So him and his wife were ousted, and that radicalized him. It's interesting because he's somebody who, one of the few presidents who became radicalized after he was president, because he was just like this liberal, left leaning guy who wanted to improve the country and change a few things. He was kicked out immediately and has since become more radicalized over time since the coup has happened. His wife, I would say, is arguably more to the left of him. She identifies as a democratic socialist. She supports Venezuela. She supports Cuba, is an admirer of Evo Morales in Bolivia, and is a supporter of 21st century socialism, which is a slogan that she has frequently raised. The party Partido Libre, Libertad y Refundación means the party of liberty and refoundation. Refoundation meaning the refoundation of the country under a new system, and we know what that system is: socialism. Obviously, in recent years, she has somewhat tapered her message because, again, right, kind of going back to what we were talking about before, whenever you're in office, you're representing a nation or a people, you're representing all sectors of society with different backgrounds. Your political message is not always going to be the same as to your base as it is to the general population. So, in a way, she's kind of tampered her message to make it, she's not necessarily saying we want socialist revolution, but she's like, we want a new Honduras that is not ruled by profit or greed, basically saying we want socialism, but in a different way. Her agenda items are very, very impressive. She wants to decriminalize abortion. She wants to trade with. Also, Honduras is one of the few countries that recognizes Taiwan, the Republic of China, instead of the People's Republic of China. So she also wants to recognize the People's Republic of China, extend the Belt and Road Initiative into Central America. Nicaragua has already done that now. So very, very important, big move for socialism. And again, that's important because Central America is very thin, connects, it's the thinnest point between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That means that trade between both oceans are opening up. Exactly. So it's the thinnest point in the Western Hemisphere between both oceans. So now you can have multiple canals, multiple trading routes for China, for Russia, for the anti-imperialist bloc between both oceans. And that's a big deal because now that means that the U.S. interests in the region are threatened. So now Honduras as well as Nicaragua will move to recognize the People's Republic of China. She's talked about joining the Bolivarian alliance. She's talked about cooperating with anti-imperialist countries, getting rid of the U.S. military bases in Honduras. So many progressive things, universal education, housing. It's going to be very rough and tough for her because, as I mentioned before, the political legacy, very similar to Poland, very conservative political culture. But nonetheless, she is pledging to do a lot of great things in the country. And I think that she's somebody who this was her third time running. She ran twice before. Both times she was denied the electoral victory. She won this time fair and square, was recognized as the president elect, and I think that there are many great things to come. Hopefully, under her government, if she is able to do the things that she wants to do.
Okay, so I will read the question from chat.
Hmm.
I will read all. There is no many question because our meeting 1 week ago, I make a little publicity, but and there were many people. Now it's not the case. Okay, I will read. Saludos camaradas, saludos desde Chile, viva Nicaragua, triunfante, viva Sandino, viva Fonseca, International Revolution. Oh, there is one commenter. DDR built hospital in Managua. Somebody wrote Evgeny Ostroumov. Question. Meaning we. I think Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc. in Central South America need to create a joint armed force to peacekeeping mission and anti-color revolution mission. What do you and your guest think? Other question. Uh, 2009 coup in Honduras was the first foreign intervention that Obama supported. Question:
Yep.
what of the Nicaragua channel? Okay, so there is two questions and comments, but I will. If you have some questions
Yeah.
to Comrade Ramiro, ask now.
Yeah. Maybe answering the first question, I think that a joint military pact defense between the quote unquote, and this is what John Bolton, the former head of state of the former Secretary of State under Trump, called the Troika of Tyranny, which we now call the Troika of Resistance or the Trinity of Resistance. And I think a joint pact between Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela against imperialist intervention and against color revolutions are a wonderful idea. I think that it has to be done very carefully, though. The reason I say that is because any sort of military solidarity, like for example, when there were Cuban doctors, right? We're not talking about military, just Cuban doctors in Venezuela. The Bolton and the U.S. administration was saying, "Oh, Cuban foreign agents are training Venezuela. We need to. They're a military threat now." So, like any little presence of Cuban doctors that are non-military has been interpreted as a quote unquote national security threat. So, and even though we know it's all bullshit, right? We know it's nonsense. The U.S., because of its power and strength, can create an invasion of anything, sanctions, just based on that. So they have to tread very carefully, right? Again, we're talking about countries with small populations, some of the most impoverished countries in the region. They have to act carefully in order to do so. I think it would be wise to do that, to have, and I think they are. I think one of the biggest things also that happened this past month, a big move, is that Nicaragua left the OAS, the Organization of American States. Cuba left the OAS after with Ernesto Che Guevara in the 60s. So they've not been part of the OAS for many years, which is kind of like the governing body. It kind of be like the EU, right? Or I don't know what would be the comparison with Europe, but they left Cuba left the OAS in the 60s, and now Nicaragua is leaving the OAS, which is a big deal. That means that now all the OAS rules, statutes, whatever, Nicaragua is basically saying, fuck you guys, we don't care. We're doing our own thing. And in a way, that's kind of a precursor to that sort of military pact or military alliance between those countries. I suspect that Venezuela soon as well, if the US continues to ramp up aggression, Venezuela will leave the OAS. We're going to see more countries doing that. And I think that's sort of the slow foundation of a broader military pact. And there's also other forms of cooperation already. There's the Bolivarian Alliance for Our America, ALBA, which is a trading and diplomatic pact. There's CELAC, the Central American and Latin American alliance. So I think it's looking bright for that. I think probably it'll get once it gets to the point where the U.S. is talking about direct military invasion or something like that, like with Grenada or with like Panama. I think at that point, then something like that would come to manifest. But I think if they were to do that right away, I think the U.S. would try to frame it as like, oh look, they're being violent, they're being aggressive. So there's that.
About colored revolution, I can promote of the solution of socialist Poland. That in socialist Poland there was the formation named ORMO. ORMO it is Ochotnicze Rezerwy Milicji Obywatelskiej. Ochotnicze Rezerwy it is the volunteers reserve of the militia. And it was an organization that normally we had militia, but in the time of the colored revolution, there was a workers who are mobilized to beat the colored revolution, and we have this in 1968 when we have the counter-revolutionary protest of students. It is not the Polish army, it is not the militia, but the workers mobilized, came to the student and beat them. So it was something. This solution, I think, is very very good, and other socialist country can use this solution, because it is something that when you defend the socialism, it is not somebody else who defend, it's you defend your neighbors, your family. You are fighting because it's your system, and it is something and the people who were in Ormo, it was elite of the Polish working class, that they were conscious. There is the question, Bruno Hola. What has been the reaction from the Salvadoran government to Honduras having a left-wing woman president?
Great question. So interesting, in El Salvador, you have Nayib Bukele, who's the president of El Salvador, somebody who is, I would describe as libertarian, right wing, pro capitalism. He made Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, which means that a lot of hedge funds, a lot of shady forces within the capitalist libertarian right are setting up shop in El Salvador and making it sort of in a way, like a banking crypto paradise. So he's not necessarily left or socialist in any way. But what's interesting about Nayib Bukele is that he's also somebody that the U.S. is slowly distancing themselves from. Recently, the U.S. had the quote unquote Summit for Democracy. He was not invited, Nayib Bukele. He was branded as authoritarian, and he's on the right. So, mind you, that's a very interesting development, because he's somebody who is now not being praised and supported by the U.S. and is being ignored by the U.S., which is trying to distance itself from him. So maybe it may get to the point where, kind of like Erdogan and Turkey, where many years ago Turkey was seeking membership in the EU and was kind of pro EU, even though Turkey by no means has a revolutionary government. They're not socialist or anything like that. But recently, in recent years, seeing the rise in China and Russia, Turkey, and also seeing the new anti-imperialist bloc, Turkey has been trading with Venezuela. Turkey has been trading with China and Russia more, and looking a little more east. And I think that maybe with El Salvador seeing the kind of trend, Nicaragua, Sandinismo is there to stay. Daniel Ortega is there to stay. Honduras, Xiomara Castro Zelaya and the Partido Libre is now going to be the governing rule. The pink tide is once again resurging in Latin America. So maybe he'll see the trend and he'll be like, okay, maybe he's not going to become a socialist. I doubt it. But maybe he'll have the common sense and reason to be like, maybe I should be on good terms with these guys if I don't want to completely isolate myself and be taken out in a coup. Kind of like what happened to Noriega in Panama, where he was not necessarily a leftist at all, but he was kind of surrounded and isolated and taken out in a U.S. military operation. So I think that he's not going to El Salvador is not going to move to the left by any means in terms of the government. But I'm sure that he'll see the trend and that he'll want to cooperate more with Honduras and Nicaragua.
Okay, comrade. I don't know how many time you have, but I have one more big subject which I want to
Sure.
ask you.
Yeah, maybe we could do one more question and then we could just wrap up.
Okay, so I would like to ask you about United States.
Hmm.
What is your strategy for United States? With which left you collaborate? What do you think about the CPUSA? What do you think about the organization of Caleb Maupin,
Hmm.
CPI, Center of Political Innovation? Are you member of Communist Party? Which one? What do you think about the PSL, Party for the Socialist and Liberation? Because the comrade Patricia Gorky was here, very good speaker. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question, connecting it as well with where I am. And my perspective is different as somebody. I'm from Honduras. I'm from an oppressed. I'm from one of the countries that the U.S. has bullied and colonized over and over and over for many years. So my connection to quote unquote American socialism is very different from somebody whose family has been here for generations. I think you'll see something similar in France, right? Like I have the same connection to the US that Ho Chi Minh had to France, where when Ho Chi Minh was in France as a Vietnamese person, as a Vietnamese man from a nation that France has colonized and destroyed, his observations of the French Communist Party as only focusing on winning concessions and improvements for French people only, um, was very interesting, right? Because Ho Chi Minh was somebody who had a very radical political transformation. He went to France, he saw the French Communist Party, and saw that many French leftists didn't even know where Vietnam was or French Indochina at the time. They didn't care as long as they got concessions for themselves, and that made him more of an anti-imperialist, of an internationalist, of defending the global South. A movement against imperialism, not necessarily saying fuck France, but kind of understanding, right? Like my struggle and my role in this revolution is with my people in Vietnam. And in many ways, I identify with that in the sense that that's not to say I don't care about what happens in the US. I obviously live here, and I hope that we can achieve socialism. But I think that my background as somebody from an oppressed nationality from Latin America, a small, poor country that has been destroyed by violence, gangs, coups, everything from the US is kind of different from somebody who has been born here and has had multiple generations. I think in general that I consider myself a non-denominational communist. I think that I support working with all sorts of leftists. If you're, I'm a Marxist Leninist. I defend Stalin. I'm an admirer of Stalin. But if you're Trotskyist, I'll work with you. If you're a Maoist, I'll work with you. If you're a social democrat, if you're a black nationalist, if you're against imperialism, which I think is the main contradiction, the primary enemy, the banks, the monopolies, the cosmopolitan elites. If you're against imperialism, then I'm your comrade and I'll work with you and I'll be in alliance with you. I have a lot of respect for PSL. PSL does good work, a lot of good demonstrations. I have a lot of respect for the history of the CPUSA. William Z. Foster, of many revolutionary leaders in the CPUSA historically. I have a lot of admiration for my friend Caleb. Who was just on my stream earlier. I've known him for close to 10 years now. He's a good friend of mine. Me and him go way back when I used to live back in New York, where I'm from. I have respect for CPI, who was recently in Nicaragua. So at the end of the day, even though and one of the problems in the left, I'm not sure if it's like this in Poland or in France, but in the US, one of the problems is that people treat the left too much like high school or like religious cults, where they're like, I'm this and I'm only this. I'm not gonna, if you talk to them, you're impure, you're this, you're that. I'm not like that. You know what I'm saying? I personally am not part of any party or any group. As of now, I'm doing my own thing. I am active in the Nicaragua Solidarity Movement, and I'm active in a lot of different movements as well. But I'm not necessarily part of a party or anything like that. But I work and talk with everybody, man. I think that's the important thing. I take that kind of like we were talking about earlier with Kim Il Sung saying we need socialist unity and cooperation on all fronts, united front against imperialism. That's my line as well, man. Because there's people on the left who get very dogmatic about it, and very stuck in their way, where they don't want to work with anybody that they disagree with, and that's just impossible. No two people in the world are going to think exactly the same way, and that's fine. That's okay, and that's actually a good thing, because that's actually how you learn and you build within the left. And I think because of social media, because people have been able to build these little silos, ideological silos, people get so wrapped up into like, oh, I'm this and I'm not that. That's not how Marxism works. Marxism is a science that evolves and adds new things and adapts and changes and continues to grow. And I think that's how any revolution in the US will happen. And I think that, for example, right, one of the things I spoke to you about, comrade, before is that, like, I identify as a patriotic socialist, but I'm not an American patriotic socialist. Why do I make that distinction? Because the United States or America is not like any other country, right? The United States is a corporation, is an empire, and has a radically different history than, say, Honduras, than Nicaragua, than Cuba, and then the African nations whose birth as a nation was rooted in the anti-colonial struggle, whereas the birth of the United States was rooted as a colonial empire. When we look at the history of the U.S. as a banking institution, the first flag of the U.S. is the flag of the East India Company, right? As it was created as a giant tax haven of white settlers who came to the United States. So like, and at the same time, however, I'm also of the belief that just because you're white, or just because you're a white American who has been in the US, that doesn't mean that you should be talked down to, that you have no role. You have a role in the revolution, but that role is going to look different from somebody in Vietnam or Africa. So I think that, just to kind of sum up, like, I think that even though I have disagreements with people on all sorts of different things, I'm willing to work with different people of different perspectives on the left, as long as you oppose imperialism. And I think that we have to be able to work with different peoples of different tendencies. And I think in the US, for me personally, I believe that any sort of socialism cannot be built on land that was stolen. There has to be reparations to the third world, to Black and Indigenous peoples. Who's, like, right now, I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, California, which is stolen land from Mexico, from Indigenous peoples, right? And I think that in order to build any sort of socialism in the U.S., we have to address that. Otherwise, the peoples of oppressed nationalities, you're going to lose them. They're not going to be really supportive. So ultimately, I support unity among all working class and oppressed peoples against imperialism of all backgrounds. But I do think that people in the left in you can't like the left in the United States can't just copy and paste what the left is doing in oppressed global South countries. You have to understand that this is the most powerful empire on the planet, and that nationalism in the US has a completely different character than nationalism in a small oppressed third world nation.
If everybody have thinking like you, I think that the Marxist movement will be not the joke, sarcastic joke of the
Right. Yep.
a lot of splits, a lot of
Oh yeah.
this. When you said that you are Marxist from the oppressed nation and you lived in the USA, 1 week ago I watched your stream about Stalin, And
Hmm.
I think that it is history also of Stalin. He also was from oppressed nation, and after he lived in Russia. So I hope that you will go this way. But when you said about Ho Chi Minh, you said that you want to return to your own country and make
Yep.
the yeah, and
I would
make the
love to.
communist revolution, there in
I would love
Honduras.
to. Definitely. I would love to do that at some point. Me and my girlfriend talk about that all the time,
Mm.
returning back to our nations. I love the people of the US. That's not to say, the same way I'm sure you would want to go back to Poland at some point to rebuild Polish communism. I think that obviously class struggle is primary. As a Marxist, class is the primary base, but also we have, as Lenin's brilliant contribution is national liberation, and that's why I admire Stalin a lot, because even though he was Georgian, right? Because there's also the chauvinism. They talk about great Russian chauvinism. Lenin talks about this, Stalin as well, that a lot of times, like, um, within the Eastern Europe, because Russia is such bigger country, there can be chauvinism against Ukrainians, Georgians, Slovak, Serbian, right? And that is a reality. And but that didn't stop Stalin from working with the Russians and being like, yeah, I'm Georgian, I'm from an oppressed nationality, but I'm still going to work with you. I'm still going to build. And I think that's sort of like what I would like to see in North America or Latin America, is like a new socialist federation. You know how the Soviet Union, right? I always say it wasn't the Russians who defeated the Nazis, it was the Soviets. And that included Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Ukrainians, Romanian, everybody. And I think that and Russia was one of many socialist republics within the Soviet Union, and that's what I think we would need to do within North America if we wanted to build. Instead of debating, oh, U.S. or not U.S., let's build something new. Let's get there when we get there, but build something new that represents all people. If it was like Apache, socialist republic, Black New African Socialist Republic, Appalachia, understand creating a new entity. And I think that's something that the brilliance of Stalin and Lenin is, that they were able to like maintain Russian nationalism and identity, but also equalize and balance some of that chauvinism, where they worked with Ukrainians and Bulgarians and Hungarians and other people together as this new entity called the Soviet Union. So that's something what I would like to see.
I think that there is some things which are similar to us, but in the same way they are not similar, because when I am living in France from I emigrated in 2013, and when I came to France, I first years in France I tried to be active in the French communist movement, especially here in Paris. There are a lot of Marxist group, communist parties, in every day, every week you can find something in Paris, and there are the big bibliothèque with the Marxist things, the archive of Communist Party, Trotsky's archive, a lot of stuff. I came from Poland, where communist movement is not existing, or are very, very weak. I came to France, and oh wow, very, very great communist movement. So my first impression is that, so I will be like Stalin, fuck Poland. I will become a member of some of the French Communist Party, and it will be my story. But after a few years, I started to understand that, of course, there are this party, but nothing is good for me. You are in the similar situation,
Yep.
but the
Hmm.
difference is that, from my perspective, maybe I'm wrong, but you are from perspective that the big socialist movement is in Latin America,
Hmm.
not in USA. In USA, it is joke. It is
Right.
very. So I understand your if you are if I am in your situation, that I look for the Latin America and victory of Morales, victory of Chavez, victory Pedro Castillo, Daniel Ortega. You speak Spanish, you can go and be active, because I think that there are something changing now there. And in USA, I think that nothing will change in next 10 or 20 or 9, how many years. But it's this is my question. Do you think that it is possible to in the near future to reconstruct the Communist Party? Do you think that your activity of Caleb, I don't know, Infrared,
Hmm.
the other channel, is this YouTube, it can change something, or it is something only blah 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 and nothing will
Yeah,
change?
I think it's possible. I think any here's the thing, right? I never want to put people down. I think any if you're spreading the message, if you're informing people, I think that's a positive thing. I think that is good. But I think the fact that we're talking about revolution, but other peoples in the world are doing it, just shows how different the movements are in the Americas compared the U.S. compared to Latin America. I think in the future, the U.S. It's possible, and it'll happen in an unexpected way. I think it'll be a combination of many things. Because I think like a lot of times we get stuck in the U.S. left, like, oh, it's going to happen this way, it's going to happen that way, it's going to happen this way, and it may be a sum total of all of those things that culminate together into a new movement, like Occupy Wall Street. I remember when that happened, it came out of nowhere, like it was very unexpected, and it just happened, and it came. There were some libertarians who were in it, there were some communists who were in, and it had all these different tendencies that composed of it, and it was very beautiful for a moment. Obviously, it went away, but that's how it kind of is. Revolution is spontaneous, and when that spontaneity, as Lenin talks about, the role of the communist is to bring that spontaneity in a revolutionary direction that is organized, that is militant, that is working toward a socialist program. And I think that what I would like to see is a combination of everybody coming together. So that's, I can't predict the future. I think it's revolution is possible. As Lenin said, the conditions can change within 24 hours. And I think that anything can happen. And I think that everybody has a role to play. That's really what it comes down to. Everybody has a role to play, but that role looks different for everybody. Some people are going to be doing streams and YouTube. Some people are going to be going to street protests. Some people are going to be traveling to the global south, bringing aid. Everybody has it's like a play, right? The analogy I always use is that revolution is like a play. Like you go to a theater, there's some people who are the protagonists, who are the actors. There's some people back scenes pulling the rope, right? There's some people background dancers. There's some people with the lights. There's some people making sure everybody has their costumes. Everybody has a role to play, but that role looks different for every person depending on where they live, and that's okay. So that's kind of how I see it.
Okay, thank you, comrades. I hope that I spoke with many comrades in this channel, but I think that you are the most guy with optimism, and there's something the revolutionary. I don't have word, but that. Uh, many Marxists, it is sectarian guys. I also maybe I'm a little sectarian, and when I see somebody like you who are open-minded, collaborate with everybody, it's you are my idol. And
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. And anytime you want to come, hope to have you on my podcast soon, man. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Invite me, and I hope that we will continue our discussions, because there are a lot of things which we are in common. I think that
Most
that uh,
definitely.
that we came from the countries, the poor neo-colonial countries with the Catholic background.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay, see you.
Exactly. All right,
I will
brother.
finish this, but